We're going to get started and everyone else can kind of filter in. I'll go a little slowly. Um, but good evening, everyone. And thank you so much for tuning in this evening for Pequot Library's Meet the Author program with Adam Hochschild. When I was a sophomore in college, I first encountered Mr. Hochschild's work through King Leopold's Ghost. Published in 1998, King Leopold's Ghost categorized and brought to contemporary public attention the vast atrocities committed in the Congo Free State by King Leopold II of Belgium and his agents in Africa. Having won the prestigious Mark Lynton History Prize, as of 2013, it has sold more than 600,000 copies. Hochschild has published significantly on a wide variety of subjects, from the atrocities committed by Joseph Stalin in the history of abolitionism in the United States to the moral drama of World War I and American volunteerism in the Spanish Civil War. Adam Hochschild has categorized the controversies and issues plaguing modern humanity. This evening, Adam will be concentrating his talk on his most recent title, American Midnight, The Great War, A Violent Peace, and Democracy's Forgotten Crisis, published in 2022. Exploring the mass hysteria that faced the United States prior to and during the First World War, the shocking parallels with our modern times are startling. Before I hand everything over to Adam, I'd like to note an interesting connection that I am incredibly excited about, and I can't stop talking about. As many of you know, the Pequot Library Association, which is a special collections and circulating library, was founded by the Marquand and Monroe families. Owing to the financial generosity of Frederick Marquand and his adopted daughter, Virginia Marquand Monroe, this association library has been able to thrive. Tonight's speaker, Adam, also happens to be directly related to Frederick Marquand. His mother, Mary Marquand Hochschild, was the daughter of Alan Marquand, an accomplished art historian and the first director of the Princeton Museum of Art. Alan's father, Henry Gurdon Marquand, who was instrumental in the founding of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, was Frederick Marquand's brother. So we at the Pequot Library are beyond thrilled to host Adam and continue the legacy of Marquand family involvement here at Pequot Library. Lastly, before we get started, I'd like to thank all of you for showing up this evening. As many of you know, Pequot Library raises 80% of its operating budget from individual contributions. Dynamic programming such as this wouldn't be possible without your continued support. So thank you all so much. And ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Mr. Adam Hochschild.
Okay, thank you, Charlie. It's good to be with you, and I'm fascinated by the Marquand connection. As I was saying to Charlie before we got started, I know very little about the Marquand family, although I did learn one interesting fact recently, which I have to share with you, which is this. The father of Frederick Marquand and of Henry Gurdon Marquand, my great-grandfather, immigrated to the U.S. from the Isle of Guernsey, one of the Channel Islands. The name Marquand is extremely common there. An aunt of mine who went there trying to find some relatives said half the people in the phone book here are named Marquand.
Really?
But somebody told me recently that Marquand actually is a corruption of the French marchand, which means merchant, and that was a euphemism for pirate. So it's quite possible I have some pirate ancestors if you go back hundreds of years. Maybe in your library you've got materials which could shed some light on that.
So I'm going to start spreading that into fact. I'm going to say the Marquand family is descended from pirates. I think it's a fun story, and that's now on the record.
Good. Well, I've always wanted you. So find me a good pirate as
Absolutely.
ancestors. So all right, let me share my screen and start talking about the book that I want to whose content I want to share with you tonight. So you should be seeing the cover of the book on the screen. Can you?
Yep, we can see it perfectly.
Good. Okay. All right. I'd like to begin talking about this period by asking you to think about some of the most dramatic and shocking events of the last couple of years. A president who tried to steal an election, the January 6, 2021 assault on the Capitol, the killing of George Floyd on camera. But imagine if 100 years from now, the standard history of this period said little or nothing about any of these things. That, I think, is the case today when textbooks treat the America of 100 years ago. There were equally shocking things that happened then, but we've forgotten about them and at our peril. So think back to your high school American history textbook. And if any of you didn't go to high school in the United States, this is a little lesson in American mythology. There was always a chapter on the First World War when the nations of the old world were tearing each other apart, dying by the millions, while across the Atlantic, the United States was at peace, a country of small town churchgoers, new industries, hardworking farmers. Then those nasty German submarines began sinking American ships, and President Woodrow Wilson declared, enough is enough. We need to make the world safe for democracy. He asked Congress to declare war, and it did. American troops went to Europe, the doughboys in their forest ranger hats. They fought bravely. They helped win the war. And then that chapter of the textbook, or at least of my high school history textbook, ended. You turned the page, and the next chapter of American history began. The Roaring Twenties, Flappers, the Charleston, Prohibition, speakeasies, and of course, the heyday of Babe Ruth. But what I want to talk about is a missing chapter between those two. I said that the image of the United States before it went to war in 1917 was that it was a peaceful country. But this was not so. It was a tinderbox of tension with three big conflicts going on. One was between business and labor. Routinely, dozens of people were killed in labor strife each year. In 1913, 1914 alone, for example, more than 70 people were killed, many of them women and children, in battles over a miners' strike in Colorado. The second conflict that was roiling in this country was between nativists and immigrants. You can see some of that reflected in this sign and in this one. And finally, there was immense tension between Black and white Americans. Most Black Americans were doing miserable, low-paid work, like picking cotton as sharecroppers, and most white people wanted to keep them in such jobs. So these were some of the tensions in this not very peaceful country of ours. And when the United States entered the First World War in 1917, it was like pouring gasoline on three sets of flames. Going to war does strange things to a country. There was an absolute frenzy of hyper-patriotism. This photo shows Boy Scouts racing down Fifth Avenue in New York 2 weeks after war was declared. Here's the movie star Douglas Fairbanks at a rally urging people to buy war bonds. From the moment the US entered the war came a fierce propaganda barrage from the government. This is a US Army recruiting poster. There was tremendous paranoia about spies. And I heard about this atmosphere from my father, who was 24 years old in 1917, living in New York City. He was the son of a Jewish immigrant from Germany, and the family around the kitchen dinner table spoke German at home. But they were terrified of doing so on the street because you could get beaten up for speaking German in public. Schools and colleges stopped teaching German. Several states passed laws against speaking German in public or on the telephone. Signs went up everywhere, like this one at a park in Chicago. All over the country, there were Literally dozens and dozens of bonfires of German books. This one was outside a high school in Baraboo, Wisconsin. Robert Krager was a miner in Collinsville, Illinois, who had the bad luck to be German born. One day he was seized by a drunken mob, wrapped in an American flag, forced to sing the Star Spangled Banner, and lynched. Here are the people who lynched him. They were put on trial. The jury deliberated for 10 minutes and found them innocent, while a military band played in the courthouse rotunda. Anti-German hysteria appeared in other ways. There was no more Mendelssohn Wedding March at weddings, for instance. Names changed. Berlin, Iowa became Lincoln. East Germantown, Indiana became Pershing. Families named Schmidt became Smith, and the Frankfurter became the hot dog. But this mood of paranoia was not just a matter of small town lynchings and book burnings. There was ferocity in the air at the very highest level. Take, for example, Elihu Root. In 1917, he was a special emissary of President Woodrow Wilson. He had previously been Secretary of State, Secretary of War, Senator from New York, Wall Street lawyer, the absolute epitome of Wall Street to Washington respectability. He told an audience in New York in the summer of 1917, and I'm quoting directly, "There are men walking about the streets of this city tonight," he said, "who ought to be taken out at sunrise tomorrow and shot for treason. There's some newspapers published in this city every day, the editors of which deserve execution for treason." The daily newspapers of this era, by the way, were by and large terrible. They usually just uncritically echoed whatever government officials said, just as the New York Times is doing here. People like Root were as fierce as they were about the war because there was considerable resistance to it. Many Americans felt the US had no legitimate reason to get involved in a European quarrel. There were peace demonstrations. There were popular anti-war songs like this one. There were some newspapers and magazines that were opposed to the war. A particularly strong voice was a magazine called The Masses, the liveliest magazine in America at the time. It was left-leaning but not doctrinaire. It published John Reed, Walter Lippmann, Sherwood Anderson, Edna St. Vincent Millay, many of the best writers, poets, artists of the day. In many ways, it was a precursor to the New Yorker, with its mixture of fiction and reportage, good artwork. It pioneered the style of cartoon, which the New Yorker has made so famous, where you have one line of dialogue as the caption. There were political figures who spoke out against the war. Eugene Debs, for example, several times the socialist candidate for president. He'd won 6% of the popular vote in 1912. The charismatic anarchist and feminist leader Emma Goldman, who immediately started organizing against the draft as soon as Congress passed that law. 6 US senators voted against going to war. The most outspoken was Robert La Follette of Wisconsin. He asked, if this is a war to make the world safe for democracy, why don't we advocate self-determination for Ireland, for Egypt, for India? These were, of course, colonies of our new ally, Great Britain. La Follette began receiving nooses in the mail. He was hanged in effigy at the University of Wisconsin, his alma mater. Other senators opened an investigation over whether he should be expelled from the Senate. Debs and Goldman had a much tougher time, and I'll come back to them. The government moved very aggressively to suppress anti-war demonstrations of all kinds. Anyone who refused military service was locked up in army detention camps like this one, or sent to prisons which were even harsher. In these military prisons, if these conscientious objectors refused to do the 8 hours of labor required from prisoners every day, They were shackled to their cell bars for those 8 hours that they were meant to be working. This drawing was made by an artist from that magazine, The Masses, who had himself endured that punishment as a prisoner. The government crackdown on dissent had help from vigilantes. Organizations sprang up around the country, the most important of which was something called the American Protective League. Its members got to wear badges like this, and if you can read the inmost ring of lettering on the badge, it says Auxiliary to U.S. Department of Justice. This organization was chartered by the Justice Department and worked together with it. By the end of 1917, it had more than 200,000 members. It was made up of men too old for the army, but who wanted to feel the thrill of belonging to something paramilitary here at home. What did they do? Among other things, they carried out what they called slacker raids to find unmen registered for the draft. By the tens of thousands, these guys would be rounded up, roughed up, then held in custody until their desperate families could produce the necessary paperwork from home, or if they couldn't produce it, they were trucked off to the army. Sometimes also a slacker was somebody who didn't buy a war bond. But slacker raids by the American Protective League were the comparatively mild side of vigilantism in these years. Other expressions of it were much worse. Here's one such episode. The men referred to in this headline were Wobblies, members of the country's most militant labor group, the Industrial Workers of the World, in Tulsa, Oklahoma. They were severely beaten and tarred and feathered. What the article doesn't say is that one of the leaders of the masked vigilantes who carried out this action was the local police chief. And how, by the way, was the editor of the local daily newspaper able to write an eyewitness account? He had been tipped off in advance and even brought his wife along to watch the proceedings. Here's what it looks like when you're tarred and feathered. John Meintz, the man shown here, was a Minnesota farmer who had refused to buy war bonds. The men who attacked him were put on trial, but found innocent. Someone else, an organizer for the Wobblies, had a worse fate. He was seized from his bed in Butte, Montana, and hanged from a railroad bridge outside of town. Here's his body. His name was Frank Little. He was 38 years old. His crime was coming to organized workers in a mining town where an underground accident several weeks earlier, accident and fire, had taken the lives of more than 160 miners. Which brings us to the point that the real target of repression during the war was not draft evaders or alleged German spies, it was organized labor. This was an era of expanding unions and many strikes. Business was desperate to suppress unions. Strikes were often put down by military force or by the police. And note that these police were facing textile strikers in Lawrence, Massachusetts, have a machine gun mounted on the back of their truck. The war gave the federal government and big business the perfect excuse to crack down on the left and on organized labor because they could say, you strikers are impeding the war effort. Then, in late 1917, something happened that inflamed tensions still more. The Russian Revolution. The Bolsheviks, the most radical faction of revolutionaries in Russia, seized power. And the American press was filled with cartoons like this one. The newspapers found Reds under the bed absolutely everywhere. And business and government officials were terrified, not realistically, I think, at the prospect of the Russian Revolution spreading to the United States. And combined with the patriotic fervor over the First World War, this produced what I think was really the worst political repression in the US in the last 150 years. It happened on several fronts. One was press censorship on an enormous scale. Uh, Here's again a cover of that magazine, The Masses. This issue, August 1917, was its last. It was printed, but it was banned from the US mail, which meant it couldn't reach its subscribers. Censors objected to several articles and cartoons. Here's one of the cartoons they didn't like: the Liberty Bell crumbling. And so the best magazine in the country was forced to cease publishing. Who was America's chief press censor? It was this man, Albert Burleson. He was Postmaster General, and the law gave him the power to control what went through the mail, which was how any nationally distributed newspaper or magazine had to reach its subscriber in those days. This was, of course, pre-internet, pre-radio, pre-TV. Burleson was a former congressman from Texas, very right-wing and arch segregationist. At the time he was born, his family owned 20 slaves. He loved being chief censor. Between 1917 and early 1921, he banned more than 400 specific issues of American newspapers and magazines from the mail. He forced some 75 different publications to shut down entirely. With his hatred of dissenting media, he would have been very much at home in the Trump administration. Ironically, he managed this whole censorship operation from what was then Post Office headquarters in Washington, D.C., the very building which a century later became the Trump International Hotel, where, by the way, during its incarnation as the Trump International Hotel, you could stay in the Postmaster General's suite for $4,000 a night. Another front on which the government moved was to jail critics of the war. I earlier showed you a picture of Eugene Debs. Here he is as a federal prisoner, sentenced for an anti-war speech, because something else the government was eager to suppress was the Socialist Party. And they sent many other socialists to jail as well. Like many war critics, Debs was still in jail 2 years after the war ended. In November 1920, while convict number 9653 in the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, he was again candidate for president and received more than 900,000 votes. This was the first time someone had run for president from a prison cell, but maybe not the last. We'll see. He was far from the only person sent to jail for speaking against the war. One of hundreds of others was Kate Richards O'Hare, a very prominent orator, the most prominent woman in the Socialist Party. In prison, she found herself in the very next cell to Emma Goldman, the war opponent whom we talked about earlier. And Goldman and O'Hare became close friends, and they each wrote their memories of the other. And for me, when I'm writing about people and trying to bring a period of time alive by following the people who lived through it, when two of the people you're following record their impressions of the other, it's a writer's dream. Goldman served nearly 2 years in prison, but after that, the government deployed another weapon against her. It deported her from the United States. In 1919, she and 248 other radicals the government was eager to get rid of were expelled from the country on this ship. So remember, all this was happening under Woodrow Wilson, which I think goes to show that you don't have to be a loudmouth demagogue to preside over repression. Wilson was the most genteel, scholarly, dignified president imaginable, the author of a dozen books, longtime university president, and in international politics, he was a visionary idealist. His great dream was the League of Nations, where countries would talk out their differences instead of going to war. Yet he oversaw one of the greatest assaults on American civil liberties we've ever seen. I should also add, by the way, that he was a longtime friend of my Marquand grandfather, who was a professor at Princeton and had actually previously, as a professor at Johns Hopkins, had taught Wilson when Wilson was a graduate student there. and they remained friends throughout this period. I wish I could have eavesdropped on their conversations uh, and learned what my grandfather thought about the war. I have no idea, unfortunately. The year after the war ended, 1919, saw some of the worst racial violence in American history, basically because uh, some 400,000 Black war veterans and nearly 4 million white war veterans were competing for jobs, and the jobs weren't there because the factories that had been making tanks and ships and guns and planes and ammunition had closed down. Furthermore, Black Americans were fleeing the South, trying to get out of a region where there was often an average of one lynching a week. They headed north in the Great Migration, but often met more violence there. These are white people in Chicago stoning a Black man to death in the summer of 1919. Wilson, incidentally, said almost nothing about this murderous racial violence. Lynchings took place in the North as well. The mayor of Omaha, mentioned in this headline, had intervened to try to stop a lynching. Police managed to rescue him unconscious just in time, but the Black man he was trying to save was not so lucky. He died and his body was burned. In the year 1919, more than 70 Black Americans were lynched, the highest total in over a decade, but hundreds more died in the racial fighting that took place in some 24 cities. Martial law was declared in Omaha, that's where these soldiers are, and in Gary, Indiana, Butte, Montana, and elsewhere as well. The total death toll of the 1919 race warfare was in the high hundreds. All but a handful of the dead was Black. There's no accurate total death toll because the largest number of killings were in Arkansas, where both local vigilantes and federal troops massacred Black sharecroppers who were trying to form a union. And many of the bodies of the Black victims were simply tossed into the Mississippi River and vanished downstream. Something else was going on at this time. In something that feels very eerily familiar today, the United States was swept by a frenzy about deporting people. The leading candidates for both the Republican and Democratic presidential nominations in 1920 were campaigning on promises of mass deportation. On the Republican side, it was General Leonard Wood, a blood and thunder type, who was incidentally the commander of those troops in Omaha. Meanwhile, the frontrunner for the 1920 Democratic nomination was the Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer. He was determined not to be outdone as a law and order candidate. He staged the notorious Palmer raids, in which he arrested thousands of radicals looking for people he hoped could be deported, and deported conspicuously in a way that would help his presidential campaign. Here are some of those Palmer raid victims rounded up and awaiting deportation at Ellis Island, a place that had previously been a place of hope where so many of our ancestors first entered this country. In the course of these Palmer raids, 1919 and early 1920, the raiders also seized and destroyed left-wing literature of all kinds. These are federal agents and local police in Boston. They also trashed the offices of the progressive groups where they made their arrests. This is the New York City office of the Wobblies. They were proud of having done this and invited newspaper photographers to come in and take pictures of their handiwork, which is why we have pictures like this. There was, however, an unexpected hero of this dark time, a man named Louis F. Post, and he was acting Secretary of Labor. And here's why he was important. The arrests of the people Palmer wanted deported were carried out by the Justice Department. But deportations had to be approved by the Immigration Bureau, which fell under the Labor Department. Post was a longtime progressive. He was outraged by the planned deportations. He simply believed that no one should be expelled from the US because of his or her political opinions. He was also a skilled bureaucrat, trained lawyer, an ardent believer in civil liberties. He found legal problems with the arrest warrants, invalidated most of them, got most of the people awaiting deportation out of jail, and saved thousands of people from being expelled from the United States. This enraged the real architect of the Palmer raids, who was a 25-year-old Justice Department official just at the beginning of a long career, J. Edgar Hoover. He was furious. He prepared a dossier against Post. He got the American Legion to demand Post's firing. He got Congress to investigate Post, but Post held on, kept his job to the very end of the Wilson administration. Hoover lost his battle with Post, but went on to win many others. He really got his start in these years and began on a huge scale something that continued for a century, which was government infiltration of and surveillance of progressive groups of all kinds. And Hoover wanted the country to know that he was monitoring dangerous people like this. For example, men like these. This is the front page of a newspaper in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1920, about some people arrested in a bomb plot by the IWW, the Wobblies. 3 suspects. And according to Hoover and the Justice Department, the kingpin was the man shown at the upper right. Pittsburgh radicals knew him as Lewis Walsh. He was secretary of the local Wobbly branch. He was active on the strike committee for a big steel strike, a member of all the left-wing organizations in town, friend of local socialists. And Walsh was violent. During a streetcar driver's strike, for instance, he and another man jubilantly beat a strikebreaker unconscious. It's the beating referred to in the second deck of this headline. Somebody obviously very suspicious in the eyes of the authorities. But the whole time, he was really Agent 836 of the Bureau of Investigation, predecessor of the FBI, periodically slipping away from Pittsburgh to meet Hoover in Washington or New York and brief him. And some of what the Pittsburgh Wobblies were accused of doing was actually instigated by him. He was unmasked several years later, then had a long career above ground. Here he is much later in life as a National Guard intelligence officer. Another aspect of these years, 1917 to 21, is that not only did the Justice Department greatly increase its undercover actions against progressive activists of all sorts, but so did the US military. And I'm going to show you an example of their thinking. The military of that era thought very much in ethnic terms. Italians might be anarchists. Jews might be socialists or communists. The Irish might be Irish Republican Army fighters. And Black Americans, of course, were an all-around threat. Here's a reflection of those prejudices. It's an ethnic map of New York City prepared by military intelligence in 1919. And you'll recognize it, I'm sure, as the upper right-hand shoulder of Manhattan. And it shows that northeast corner of Manhattan, color-coded by where people of dangerous ethnicities are living. Red is for Russian Jews, brown is for Italian, dark gray is for Black people, the bluish areas are for Irish. The numbers on the map in the sort of round circles, red bordered circles, refer to union halls, IWW offices, and other dangerous meeting places. The blue stars with the numbers are the offices of suspicious publications, such as labor union newspapers and even the Journal of the NAACP. Military paranoia was so great that the Army even prepared a contingency plan for putting the United States under martial law. complete with wording of the proclamation that the president should issue on that occasion. Happily, things did not reach that point, but it's a reminder of how close to the brink we came. Gradually, the repression eased. There were demonstrations urging the release of those still in jail. In 1921, Warren Harding became president, and at last, in response to those generations, he slowly let almost all of the remaining political prisoners out of jail. He felt it safe to do because Woodrow Wilson's repression had basically accomplished its purpose. The labor movement, the Socialist Party, progressive forces of all kinds were severely crippled. It's remarkable and appalling to realize just how many political prisoners there were during those years. And by political prisoners, I mean people who were sent to jail not for doing anything, but for things that they wrote or said. During this period of frenzy, 1917 to 21, roughly 1,000 Americans went to jail for a year or more, and a far larger number for shorter periods, solely for things they wrote or said. The best known of those, of course, was Eugene Debs. Harding finally released him after 2.5 years in prison, and even invited him for a visit to Washington on his way home. Here's Debs leaving Harding's office after that visit. He joked that he'd run for president 5 times, but this was the first time he'd actually gotten to the White House. So, what can we conclude about this era? First, I think it's a reminder of the dark currents that have long run through this country: racism, xenophobia, an eagerness to hunt for scapegoats, vigilante justice. And it's a reminder of how easily those toxic forces can be unleashed. We've seen that again in recent years. And secondly, it's a reminder of how vigilant we need to be. What if a century ago, when they started throwing people in jail for the speeches they made, when they started shutting down newspapers and magazines, hundreds of thousands of people had taken to the streets and said, "No, you can't do this." I think those years I've been talking about might have unfolded quite differently. And that, I think, is the lesson we have to take from this period for today. It's a good time to remember the words that Emma Goldman spoke when she was put on trial in 1917. "Gentlemen of the jury," she said, remember, no women on juries in those days, "we respect your patriotism, but may there not be different kinds of patriotism? Our patriotism is that of the man who loves a woman with open eyes. He is enchanted by her beauty, yet he sees her faults. So we who know America love her beauty, her richness, her great possibilities. Above all, do we love her great apostles who dream and work for liberty. But with the same passionate emotion, we hate her cant and her corruption." It was a good definition of patriotism then, and I think it still is today. So that, I hope, is a short view of the chapter missing from your high school history textbook. At least it was missing from mine. Thanks for watching. Why don't I stop my screen share now, and I'd be happy to hear any comments or questions.
That was
And
absolutely incredible, Adam. Oh my gosh. The one one thing, so I taught high school history for a little while, and it's really interesting because none of that is mentioned in the current history curriculum, except Debs is mentioned. So
Mhm.
Eugene Debs has somehow found his way into the contemporary Common Core curriculum, which I think is interesting that that's the chapter that's kind of made its way in. So guys, if we have any questions for Adam, please put them into the Q&A. He'd be happy to answer them. I'm sure there are a few, but I'm gonna start off with one quickly that
Okay.
so throughout your career, you've had a multitude of different historical periods and countries and events that you're looking at. Um, what do you think unites all of those different books? Like, so for example, um, what would unite King Leopold's Ghost with your text on the Spanish Civil War? What do you think the unifying factors are between those two texts? Because I
Well, I
get
like,
I get
yeah, I like to find times and places where people are engaged in some kind of fight to make a better world, whether it is to expose the atrocities that were part of the European colonization of Africa, whether it was to end slavery in the British Empire, which my book Bury the Chains is about, whether it was to fight what was essentially the first battle of the Second World War against fascism in Spain in the 1930s. And in this period that I wrote about in American Midnight, people fighting to keep alive civil society in this country, the right to dissent, the right to protest what the government was doing. So I like to find times and places where there seemed to me to be a significant moral or political battle going on, and then to bring those periods alive by following the lives of 6, 8, 10 principal characters through them. And that's what I did in this book, and that's what I've done in all of the others. And the characters are not necessarily all noble and good. Some of them are on the what I think is the wrong side, and some of them are mixed, as most of
yeah.
us are.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. So we have some questions. Um, so Susan McHale just wrote, I recently read Fitzgerald's May Day short story, all about the 1919 riots. That was interesting. Was that blocked from publication when it initially came out?
What was the Mayday short story? I'm not.
So it's I think it's F. Scott Fitzgerald's May Day, and so that's looking at the 1919 rioting that happened in the United States. The question is, was that blocked? But also, would literature about the socialist? So it's specifically about a socialist by Fitzgerald. Um,
Yeah.
would that
I
or similar pieces of literature been blocked?
Yeah, I have to confess I don't know that story of Fitzgerald. I'm fascinated to hear that he wrote about that because it doesn't seem a very Fitzgerald-like subject in a way. I'll have to go and find it. Um, there was less censorship of books than there was of newspapers and magazine, but there was still some. And I cite some cases of it in the book where the government sent messages to libraries of what books they wanted taken off the shelves. So this was a time when, the authorities assumed they had the right to censorship.
Mhm, mhm. So parallels are incredible because you're looking at stuff that's going on all throughout the country where certain pieces of literature or certain books are kept out of libraries. Um, we're representing a library right now, so the parallels are incredible. So another question from Timothy Lydgate is in reference to um, the dynamic discussed in your book. What can an ordinary citizen do to combat this toxic dynamic?
Well, I think the main thing is to join with other ordinary citizens in whatever organizations you think are effective. Uh, there are all kinds of groups now, as we see in every national election, who do everything from sending postcards to voters in swing states to going to those states to volunteer, going and knocking on doors. Unfortunately, under our totally weird electoral vote system, it's 6 or 8 states that always determine the outcome of presidential elections, and that's where campaigning is concentrated. Although, of course, every seat in the House of Representatives will be up for reelection this fall. A third of the seats in the Senate. There are a lot of places where you can get involved in political campaigns. There are, there's a sort of renewal of an attempt to organize labor unions in this country in the last couple of years, um, whom I'm sure would welcome supporters of various types. Uh, there are people working with asylum seekers who are trying to help them find political asylum because, despite all our problems, people still want to come to the United States, escaping from places where political oppression is really severe. So I think there's no shortage of things that can be done. You just have to look around, be creative, find the right organizations to join, the right effort to take part in. Um, Maybe what feels most effective will involve, going to work in another state for a little while. But I'm sure in every community there are efforts that matter and can help create a better society.
That's wonderful. And I mean, that's great because sometimes when we're hearing all about kind of the atrocities that are going on at home and abroad, it's very easy to feel helpless. So knowing that there is this chance for individual agency is really, really important. So we have another question and comment from John Bruce McGurk. He said, "Wonderful presentation, thank you." And this is great. He learned about much of this in AP American History, which is another that's really reassuring and great. Has there ever been a war in American history in which this sort of backlash against dissent did not happen? Was there much reflection on this period in the 20s and 30s as we reflect on the Red Scare from the 50s? It's a great question.
It is a good question, and there was. I've recently been immersed in the 1930s, exploring that territory for a possible book. And you do find a lot of the progressives of that era, the people around Franklin Roosevelt, talking about how this country went astray during the First World War. When, then also the country was under a president who was a Democrat, and there were some continuities, people who were still Mitchell Palmer, the ghastly Attorney General of Woodrow Wilson, helped to write Roosevelt's platform in 1932. So um, there were some continuities. Some of the same people were still around, but some of the more progressive types, like Harold Ickes and Harry Hopkins and so on in the 30s, you find talking about let's be sure we don't go back to what happened in the era of the First World War, or the Great War, as they talked about it then. And indeed, in the 30s, we didn't. And there was much less dissent against World War II in this country than there was in World War I. But we still committed the horrible crime of locking up 100,000 Japanese Americans simply because they were of Japanese descent. I think that's the equivalent terrible thing that happened in that era. Conscientious objectors, however, were treated much better than they had been in the First War. So hopefully, there's signs that we've learned something from these excesses of the past. I also think that despite everything, despite our problems today, the the country has a greater respect for the First Amendment than it did in 1917, 1918. Um, I don't think you could get away with passing something like the first version of the Espionage Act, which was the law that the government used to carry out that censorship. I don't think a president could get away with that today. Not only was the Espionage Act passed, which essentially gave the government the right to shut down a newspaper or magazine or put somebody in prison because they opposed American participation in the war. Uh, I don't think you could get a law like that passed today. And not only was the Espionage Act passed then, but in 1919, it was early in the year upheld unanimously by the Supreme Court. And
Hmm.
however much we may criticize the Supreme Court of today, I don't think they would do the same thing. Interestingly, two of the justices who voted for that upholding the law, Oliver Wendell Holmes, who wrote the decision, and Louis Brandeis, had a change of heart during the year and voted against upholding the Espionage Act later in 1919. And that's one of the stories I tell in American Midnight.
It's fascinating. One quick question, um, just from me, just because we have you on the line here. But when you're doing historical research, on the history of dissent, and you have all of these texts, you have all of these articles that have been suppressed, does that make your job as a historian that much more difficult? It's not like these archives were well preserved or treasured. They were, if anything, um, suppressed and looked down upon. So you don't have perhaps fantastic record keeping. Did you find that to be the case, or did you find like a magazine like The Masses to be relatively easy to access?
Well, the masses, as long as it was publishing,
Mhm.
those copies have been preserved, and like many old newspapers and magazines, they're digitized these days, which means I can look at them on, or you can look at them on our home computers. You don't even have to go to a library, and that's very handy. When you're looking at stuff that was being suppressed, uh, which is the correspondence of people, for example, who were jailed or whatever, that's when being able to use a research library like yours that keeps not just published books and magazines, but letters, private papers, other archival material becomes really useful. Uh, Always, incidentally, I find fascinating material in government surveillance records. And actually,
Yeah,
this
yeah.
is the fourth book where I have gone looking for government surveillance records of one sort or another, which are to be found today in the National Archives. Certain of them have been digitized, others you have to go to the archives in Washington and dig them out.
Is this
And it
Hoover yet,
is,
or
pardon?
is this Hoover at this point, or not yet?
Yeah, Hoover, Hoover was very instrumental. Hoover in 1919 became head of something called the Radical Division of the Justice Department, which was basically keeping an eye on all these troublemakers and trying to figure out how to make trouble for them and suppress them and infiltrate them and so forth. A couple years later, he became head of the Bureau of Investigation, which then added federal to its name in the 1930s. But getting, for instance, of the guy whose picture I showed you, who infiltrated all these radical groups in Pittsburgh, he wrote hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of reports to the government, and you can look at them all today. Uh, so I love working with that kind of material. And as I say, I've done it in several other books. In my other book about the First World War period, To End All Wars, I looked at in the National Archives in Britain at surveillance records of British radicals of that era, at letters that they wrote that the government mail censors had copied, and so forth. I love looking at that kind of stuff. In the 1960s, uh, I was active in the movement against the Vietnam War, and under the Freedom of Information Act, I got more than 100 pages of government surveillance records of me. And it's a sort of fascinating
There you
lesson
go.
in how easily spies like that get things totally garbled.
Is this through Mother Jones, or was this before Mother Jones?
No, this was before Mother Jones. What triggered the surveillance of me was that in order to avoid getting drafted and sent to Vietnam, I did what George W. Bush and hundreds of thousands of other people that era did, which was I joined the reserves or the National Guard, in my case, the Army Reserve. And as it happened, I was placed, because I spoke some Russian, I was placed in a unit, an intelligence unit, which required a security clearance.
Mhm.
So I was routinely given a security clearance. And then the government began to discover me, showing up at anti-war demonstrations
Popping up
and
in places they didn't like. Yeah.
traveling to Cuba to report for Ramparts magazine. And I think that's what triggered the surveillance frenzy. But it was fascinating to look at all this material years later. The names of informants are always blacked out. Um Occasionally, you can figure out who they were. And they get things marvelously garbled at times. I'll just give you an example. I've written about this actually. Uh, when my wife and I got married in 1965, we had both been active as civil rights workers in Mississippi, and we asked people in lieu of giving us wedding presents, would they contribute to one of the groups that was trying to register voters down there?
Mhm.
And in the FBI report, this got garbled into this couple gave away all their wedding presents to Goodwill.
There you go.
So anyway, so I love looking at
Oh,
these kinds of records.
we have another question. This is great, and I'll just add a little bit of a Pequot thing to it. So a small percentage in the 1950s of our special collections, when the library was going through a bit of an identity as well as financial crisis, were sent over to the Beinecke Library at Yale.
Hmm.
And so while we have 90% of our special collections either on site or in some of our secure storage, a portion of our collection is at Yale, which is made use of by the Beinecke. The question is, did you ever go to the Beinecke at Yale to do research for any of your books?
Not to the Beinecke, but to Yale Special Collections,
Mhm.
which is in a building next door, I think. I spent 3 days there actually looking through letters from the Phelps-Stokes family. Uh, you and I, Charlie, were
Fair
talking
stuff.
about
Yeah.
that book before the presentation began. That's from my book Rebel Cinderella, which was about the marriage of Rose Pastor Stokes and Graham Stokes, who came from that family, and cartons and cartons and cartons of their letters, not from that, uh, not from the two of them, but from relatives of his, have ended up at Yale. One problem you find actually in working with archives like this is that often it's not the most interesting people who save their stuff. In the case
Yeah.
of the Phelps-Stokes family, for instance, it was Graham's brother, who was a totally boring man, who gave Yale 230 boxes of his papers. They didn't
30
have room for
boxes.
them in the
Oh my
Yale
God. I thought you were going to say
special collections. They're
papers.
stored off-site in a warehouse, which libraries often do. Whereas other people who I've written about, like George Orwell, for example, saved almost nothing.
Yeah,
So, there's no relationship to how much survives from somebody and how interesting they are.
that's so interesting.
But that's the way to get into the history books, folks. Save your letters, save your papers, keep a diary, write a memoir, and someday there will be somebody who's interested in it.
Someone's going to be
May
interested.
have to wait a few centuries, but that person will come along.
Someone's going to be interested. Well, Adam, thank you so much. This was so much fun, and I mean everyone involved learned so much. What are you working on now?
As I said, I've been rooting around in the 1930s, trying to figure out how to do a book on that period, but I haven't fully figured that out yet. So, and sometimes between books, I try to keep off the streets and out of trouble by writing magazine pieces of one sort or another. So I'm working on a couple of book reviews as well.
I'm a religious reader of the New York Review of Books, and so you pop it up in there a lot. And I read, what was it? It was your piece on I'm gonna butcher the name of the institution in Belgium, but it's like the Belgian
Oh, the
Museum.
Royal Museum for Central Africa in the
Yes,
Atlantic. Yeah,
yes, and
yeah,
oh,
yeah.
it's in the Atlantic. Sorry, I read your New York Review stuff too, but
Yeah.
I saw the Atlantic. I read the Atlantic article, and I mean that was fascinating. That was fascinating because I mean I many of us at the library were museum people as well, and so we're
Uh-huh.
always we've got our eye on properly contextualizing history from the library's perspective. We're our name's Pequot Library, right? So we're dealing with indigenous histories and properly contextualizing that as well as our name, as well as the site of our library. And so I loved that article, and it's always interesting to read about institutions outside of the United States grappling with that.
Yeah. Well, they're grappling with this all over the world, and the same issues. Uh, how do you how do you remember the past? Which artifacts do you keep? How do you display them? Who should have a say in how it's displayed? They're the same issues everywhere. Well, good luck to you in sorting out these things at the Pequot Library.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Adam. This was an absolute pleasure.
All right. Well, thank you, Charlie. It was a pleasure being with you.
Wonderful. All
So
right.
t-
Bye,
take
everyone.
care.
Thank you.